take us, I've been following this UK election quite a bit. I think the stakes, obviously, I think really things like the NHS are obviously the very nature of the basic social infrastructure of the United Kingdom are at stake here. What are the main forces, though, for people who maybe haven't been paying as much attention? Can you give us a run through of the Tories, of Labour, of the Lib Dems, any other relevant parties, and also, the bigger ideological questions, but, a lot of questions people have about, tactical voting, how the system actually works, these types of things. Just ground us in the 2019 UK general election. Yeah,
so the system over here is a first past the post system, right? That's the first and most important thing to kind of lay out there, which means that tactical voting in a certain number of cases is something that you see quite a bit during elections, but only in very specific areas. So we don't have what a lot of European systems have, which is single transferable vote or proportional representation, which means votes can be transferred. So on. It literally is the candidate that gets over first. In that way, it's pretty similar to the American system. And so where, for instance, you have a candidate who's a Tory MP, there's a Labour MP, then be trying to convince voters of other Lib Dems, Greens, or whatever to vote for that Labour MP. And similarly enough, if you have a Tory MP and the nearest is Liberal Democrat, well, then you do have sites that are arguing for voting that way. But it is pretty important to lay out that it's difficult to know with the polling landscape at the moment where individual seats are going. Because last time in 2017, the scale of Labour's comeback in the final weeks of that campaign meant that the party won a lot of seats that quite simply had never even been considered Labour territory beforehand. Places like Canterbury where the Tories were safe not only for decades, but going back in centuries in the vote. So those tactical voting sites and that kind of discussion, I think, is something you have to be relatively sceptical of, particularly because the Liberal Democrat vote is on the decline, the Labour vote is on the up. Sorry, can you guys hear me there?
Yeah, Ronan, we can hear you. It's it's a little bit of a funky connection. I don't know if we have an alternative, but we can hear you. If this needs to be it works. Tell us then about the stakes of the election and on the positive end, the incredible things that Labour's putting on the table. They put out a really great manifesto, and then the danger of the Tories. But I think it's also really important to talk about how Dominic Cummings, who's Boris Johnson's main strategist and the kind of architect of the Brexit campaign, how they are definitely part of this, this populist right that certainly understands that they should be lying about austerity, which they are. And then also, the Lib Dems, and really just, they're wreckers and they're partners in destroying the UK, if I might editorialize.
Sure.
I think people need to be really clear about that.
Yeah, well, look, the battle that's going on in Britain now is a very specific one. It is a battle along class lines. So whereas previously, in the kind of 2000s and the new Labour era, you had a Labour Party that was very centre-left, moderate, pro-corporate interests and so forth. They did things like brought private financing into the NHS. And now, under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, you've got a solidly left-wing Labour Party, a Labour Party which is standing on a platform of increasing minimum wage, scrapping anti-union laws, introducing a Green New Deal, properly renationalising and kicking out the private interest from the NHS, increasing funding for education, ending some of the really miserable welfare policies over here, like universal credit, which are pushing thousands and thousands of people into poverty, building 1 million council houses over a 10-year period. So the Labour Party now has an ambitious socialist manifesto and platform led by people, and Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell and Diane Abbott, who are lifelong socialists, people who were socialists when it was not, to be frank, so trendy as it maybe is for this generation, to be socialist. They were socialists when it really meant that they were on the complete fringes. They were MPs in a group of 5 and 6 and 7 who were totally outside of any question of power, laughed at and mocked by the media basically for their criticisms of capitalism. And now they lead a major party, one of the most significant parties in the Western world. If you think of its longevity, if you think of its size, of its membership, with about 500,000 members, if you think of the historic role that the Labour Party has played in upholding capitalism in Britain, and obviously Britain having been one of the historic powers on the world stage and maintaining the capitalist system. So we have an incredibly radical, in one sense, when you look at it through history and so forth, proposition here, which is that we have a real socialist elected to 10 Downing Street. And on the other side, we have a radicalising Tory party. So this is not, the Tory party of David Cameron either. All of these kind of old coordinates are really being trashed in this era. A bit like in the United States, where this is no longer the kind of longed for moderate Republican Party of the New York Times columnists and whatever. And now you've got the Republican Party of Donald Trump, where the mask is kind of ripped off and the reality of their politics are exposed. And it's quite similar with Boris Johnson. He's running a hard Brexit Tory party on a platform which is basically to exit the European Union, but do it in a specific way, which tears up rights and protections, tears up workers' rights, health and safety, so on, does a free trade agreement with the United States, opens up the National Health Service and God knows what other parts of the public sector to private and international investment, puts it's a kind of Margaret Thatcher on steroids program. And he's doing all this also as a figure who has, consistently been a provocateur for racist right-wing politics. Somebody who, when he was a columnist, made his life out of being one of those people who deliberately tried to annoy liberal opinion. Who said things like Muslim women looked like letterboxes when they were burqas, called black people pickaninnies, made all kinds of derogatory comments about single mothers, which we were just discussing this week, and how their children are more, propensity to violence and all the rest of it. So this is a guy who, I don't think in America you would find it that hard to imagine those kind of figures, right? You know who they are. Well, one of them is the Prime Minister here, and he's leading this Conservative Party in this election, and it's him against Jeremy Corbyn. As you said, there is a third force, the Lib Dems. There's also the question of Scotland and the SNP and so on, we'll maybe come to in a minute. But the third force, the Liberal Democrats, who, were doing very well for a period coming up to this election because basically they had the backing of liberal business interests. They positioned themselves entirely around the Brexit question. There were these big lobby groups like the People's Vote who were pushing all the time that what had to happen with Brexit is the whole thing had to be overturned. We had to have the new referendum, and actually the Lib Dems went so far as saying just we will revoke the vote altogether in this election. And they did that partly because they want a left option on the table, or an option that people who don't like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump style politics can vote for, which doesn't imply challenging corporate power, redistributing wealth, rebuilding the welfare state, giving power to workers. Because the Lib Dems, of course, were the coalition partners of the Conservatives between 2010 and 2015, during the period when the very worst austerity that was imposed in Britain was brought in, and they signed off on all of it. So they're kind of a party that represents, the kind of liberal business interests, people who are very concerned about people being respectful in their political discourse and don't like the idea of a boorish Boris Johnson, but also don't want to solve any of the kind of underlying social problems that lead to the creation and the rise of figures like Boris Johnson in the first place.
And also, just to really underline, because I've been noticing, I mean, it's so funny. I get the same kind of neurotic concern trolling now from people in the UK when I talk about the Lib Dems. And, you know, if I had confidence that there was some, you know, discredited trash centrist party, but they were going to coalition with Labour, and they had made that commitment and so on, I might be more open to it. But to the so-called tactical voting question, which you've already actually discredited and runs against the evidence we have of the Labour resurgence of 2017, which might definitely repeat itself here. But they've said quite explicitly themselves that they are not going to support a Corbyn government. They will not team with Labour. They're absolutely committed to the same austerity program that, you know, caused so much devastation and havoc the last time they had power. So, I mean, you know, I think you said it. I mean, I guess if you're a Tory who's, you know, far right wing, but doesn't feel so comfortable with like overt racism, that's your vote. But if you're anybody else and you're concerned about something like saving the NHS or dealing with the roots of the resurgence of far right populism, I mean, the Lib Dems are sort of like the classic case study of what facilitated the crisis we're in.
I would agree. I mean, my own view of it is I've done quite a bit of door knocking for Labour in this election. It's actually where it just was before this call. And, you know, you run into people who are well-meaning who are voting Lib Dem. They're people who kind of, you know, the whole conversation in the media has been so focused on Brexit for so long, to the exclusion of every other problem, that people have been to some degree blinded about what the Lib Dems record really is. And you're speaking to a person on the door and you're like, well, you know, do you support all of these austerity policies that the Lib Dems are responsible for? Do you think we should be funding the NHS? Do you believe there should be a higher minimum wage? Are you a fan of, for instance, one of the things the Lib Dems did notoriously when they were in government, which was that they massively increased the fees workers had to pay to go to employment tribunals if they were unfairly sacked? I mean, are you a fan of that kind of stuff? And people are not. And they said, you know, I hadn't thought about that because it wasn't being put forward. The critical line about, you know, what the Lib Dems had done before wasn't being put forward. And I have to be honest, I think it's part of a very serious structural problem in the British media, which is that a lot of British journalists, particularly editors and the people who own the big newspapers, they really don't want Corbyn's arguments to be on the pitch. They want it to be a culture war battle between, you know, people with nice liberal social views, people with conservative social views, and the economic question can be basically written off. And that is why the Liberal Democrats will always be their preferred kind of non-Tory option. That's why they'll always push their kind of their policies, their politics, instead of the Labour Party in its current form. Because once you get to a point where people are actually asked the economic questions, another big thing that I haven't even mentioned about Labour's platform yet is renationalisation, right? So Labour are proposing to renationalise rail, mail, energy, water. These are things that, if you look at the polls, there's overwhelming support. These things have 70, 80% support in the polls time after time after time. And there is a huge consensus behind the need for economic change, the ending of privatization, some serious action about economic inequality and regional inequality in Britain. But the media doesn't want to talk about it. It almost never came up over the last 18 months because all we discussed in Brexit was the technical details, how Britain was going to leave, what was the latest battle going on in Parliament, which MP was throwing a fit today over which part of the Brexit thing. It was a drama located within about a 1 kilometre square, 2 kilometre square space, and it neglected all of the other issues that actually led to the Brexit vote in the first place. And when you consistently frame politics that way, and there is no major newspaper outlet in this country, I think it's worth saying to your listeners, there's not one whose editorial line backs Corbyn. There are a number that, you know, are favourable to Labour, but when the question came about Corbyn's leadership, all of them, The Guardian, The Mirror, and the New Statesman, who actually won't even back Labour in this election, they all were in favour of Corbyn going. So there isn't a single media outlet of any size in this country that backs Corbyn's leadership. And so they have simply been involved in ruling his economic and political agenda off the table, and narrowing a conversation around Brexit to culture war issues, which, as we know, and as I'm sure people on the left in the United States know, is a dead end for us, because ultimately, confining the political debate to why people vote for someone like a Donald Trump, and only looking at, his rhetoric and how boorish he is and whatever, and not looking at some of the factors, for instance, in the Midwest, about long-term economic decline, the Democratic Party abandoning part of its traditional core, the fact that if you don't look at those questions, well, then it always ends up a mystery.
Right, absolutely. And it's a mystery, and then the only answers are like religious almost, and it's like you just can kind of do incantations. But get us deeper into just how dangerous the UK media is and why they've waged this unrelenting war against Corbyn. And if you could connect it, actually, you already explained the why, but maybe just a little bit more details into the monopolies and how they affect it. But then maybe connect it to this incredible conversation about anti-Semitism. Because look, I think that from where I see it, there's a little bit more sort of overt anti-Semitism across the board in the UK than there is in the United States, though that's changing. We've got a press corps approved group that are talking about Jew coups here, White House press corps approved. But the Conservative Party in the UK, in both its like traditional, like inbred grandee tradition, these are not fans of Jewish people. The former Speaker of the Parliament, John Bercow, in an interview a couple weeks ago, where he said, of course, Jeremy Corbyn is not an anti-Semite and is a member of the Conservative Party, and said, look, I've never experienced any anti-Semitism from Labour. I have maybe experienced it from some other parties or party in the UK. And then in the very modern 2019 version, Boris Johnson has apparently been advised by Steve Bannon. He is tight with Donald Trump. There are the same types of spillovers of all of the new, alt-right Nazi type movements, currying their influence as they are obviously in the United States, in the UK, even as Corbyn and the leadership have condemned anti-Semitism. And then, of course, the other issue that gets involved here is the conflation of absolutely correct, essential, and valid criticism of the state of Israel conducting, brutal, horrific, systemic human rights abuses on a daily basis, and making that anti-Semitism. So, those three things need to be kind of teased apart. And I think the media thing connects because, yes, if you read the UK, there's a big bias against Sanders here. If you read the UK press, it would make Sanders look like he was getting, the press coverage of, Beyonce.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, I have some degree of knowledge of what's going on with the US coverage of Sanders, and I know it is very skewed against them. But as you say, it's nowhere near as skewed as the coverage over here about Corbyn. And I think that part of the reason is that the left has been off the pitch for a longer time in the United States. And so your kind of media culture is not as well organized in demonizing the insurgent socialist figures. Whereas here, particularly because of what we had in the 1970s and 1980s, and you think of things like the miners' strike and all of that, you have a press that's very well able, organized around demonizing left-wing and socialist figures. They know how to do it. And in Jeremy Corbyn's case, they went around everything until they found one that stuck. And that's the truth of it, right? So it was Jeremy Corbyn is a fan of the IRA. Jeremy Corbyn is friends with Hamas. Jeremy Corbyn, won't sing the national anthem. He didn't bow sufficiently at the cenotaph. What does he think about the Queen? In fact, just today, two of the major newspapers are running front-page stories about how Jeremy Corbyn doesn't know the time of the Queen's speech on Christmas Day.
Oh my God!
It's completely absurd.
That's so offensive, Ronan. Jesus Christ!
I know, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, as an Irishman, that's not going to lose many votes with me. But the bigger picture here is that they went around until they found something that sticks, and that is this question, the anti-Semitism controversy. Exactly as you said, I think that this is one part of an international question that everyone on the left is going to have to grapple with in coming years, where we've got figures like, say, Viktor Orban, who have very well established anti-Semitic links to far-right groups who want to rewrite the whole history of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe in order to justify the right on nationalist forces and demonize the actual partisans who fought against the Nazis. And these people are now being held up as friends of the Jewish people because they are pro-Israel. Right. And this is happening, in many, many countries with many right-wing demagogues. Basically, it's been a policy of the Netanyahu government to bring in anyone who's willing to back Israel on, human rights abuses, the occupation, settlements, Jerusalem as the capital of these questions. And if they're willing to do that, they become somebody who's going to get a lot of press for being friends of the Jewish people, even if their record is very deeply anti-Semitic. Right. And that is reflected here. So where you've got a situation, as you say, that historically in Britain, the left was the home of Jewish politics. If you think of some of the great figures of the British left in recent decades, people like Eric Hobsbawm, people like Ralph Miliband, it was always the case for a very, very long time that Jewish people in Britain gravitated towards the left, and the left was the kind of pillar against the aristocratic anti-Semitism that ran through so many parts of British society, and particularly the Tory party. And Jeremy Corbyn obviously comes through from an era where those figures, particularly the two I mentioned, people like Hobsbawm and Miliband, were, the key thinkers in shaping generations of the left and their worldview. And so, it has really been turned on its head through the last number of years. You had previously seen a kind of, by degree, a migration of vote from Jewish communities towards the Tories and so on. But this controversy has really changed that historic kind of perspective. Whereas now, the only time we're hearing discussion in the press about Jewish people in this election is to say that the people can't vote for the Labour Party, can't and so on. The truth of it is Jeremy Corbyn actually was a friend of some of the most progressive and radical Jewish people in this country. I think of Max Levitas, who was there at the Battle of Cable Street when Jewish people and Irish working class people gathered together to fight against Oswald Mosley and the Union of British Fascists and drive them back from Cable Street in London. At a key moment when it really was possible that fascism was on the rise in Britain. Well, Max Levitas lived to 100, 101, 102, whatever age it was, and in his final years, he spent many of them sharing stages with Jeremy Corbyn at anti-fascist and anti-racist rallies. Right. So Jeremy Corbyn has a very strong record of standing up for the persecuted and the oppressed in general. But partly because this whole international conversation has been reshaped on the terms that I was just saying, where so much of what is, when you go in on Google now and you type in anti-Semitism and you look at the news stories, so much of it is now pivoting around the question of who's, friend of the Jewish people because they're willing to give uncritical support to Israel and who is not, or an enemy of Jewish people because they have a different perspective.
Right. So Jeremy Corbyn being a thorough, across-the-board anti-racist and supporter of justice for all in this sick, fascistic worldview where going back, at least 15 years, I mean, where, Likud and the right specifically have very self-consciously partnered with the evangelical right in the United States and neo-fascists across Europe. And of course, that includes, elements of Tory and Republican Party. Then they can somehow pull off this, lie and fraud about Jeremy Corbyn because, he holds the views on Palestinian rights that, any decent person would hold.
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it. Look, one of the difficulties that we have here is that anti-Semitism is a very specific form of racism, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're simultaneously saying that people are subhuman and that they're controlling the world. Right? This is the reason why anti-Semitism is specific and complex. We're faced with a media environment that wants to take this issue and simply use it to slander Jeremy Corbyn. Doesn't really have any interest in the question of, how do we tackle anti-Semitism in the 21st century and what does it look like? They're interested in taking this question and slandering Corbyn with it. I think the left has a greater responsibility there to think ourselves through some of these questions and ask, is it possible that, say, for instance, a lot of people who gravitate towards the left for the first time, who haven't been that interested in politics and so forth, they see some injustice in Israel, they go onto Google and type in the word Zionist and they can find,
right,
things that are quite straightly wrong on anti-Semitic and conspiracies about the Rothschilds and whatever. Like, we have to be real. We actually care about the issue and say that happens, and we've got to fight against it.
Right.
But this is not characteristic of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party has a lot of left-wing Jewish people in it. A lot of left-wing Jewish people backing his agenda very strongly. In fact, the people who are most active in the anti-fascist and anti-racist struggles in this country are almost uniformly behind Corbyn and the Labour Party. And it is just really unfortunate that we have this situation that has actually a sense amongst a lot of people who are maybe not that political in the Jewish community, when they're seeing headline after headline in the press day after day about Corbyn, being an anti-Semite, that people have a concern about what that means, and if this guy gets elected. And in my view, that is a deeply irresponsible thing for the press to be convincing people of, where you've got a community that has had a history of persecution and so on, to portray a figure like Jeremy Corbyn, who, yes, people mightn't agree with his position on Israel. He made one mock-up about a mural, which became the big story of all of this.
And that was absolutely a mistake of his, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, we should talk about that incident, right? Because I think it's worth doing.
Yep.
Where it was it was a mural in his constituency. Some guy had put it up, and there was basically New World Order style stuff on it, which had anti-Semitic overtones without question. And Corbyn liked and commented something on Facebook about, the council was going to take it down, and he was opposed to it. Almost certainly because, this guy was a local artist who was trying to put up what he considered a political message and whatever, and Corbyn was trying to give him some support.
Right.
He should have looked at that more clearly. When he did, he apologized for it, but it was a stupid mistake. But taking that and moving it into a point where we are now, where people, are being told that their future in the country is under threat, they will be persecuted, it's so incredibly irresponsible. And it has created a serious problem. Luckily, during this campaign, there have been a lot more prominent left-wing Jewish voices. I think of people like David Graeber, the academic, who came out with a statement the other day that went viral on Twitter, where he talked about this, and he said, I'm a Jewish person. I have a great knowledge of the history of persecution of Jews, as somebody who's a historian and anthropologist, and I can say without any question that people who want to stop the next wave of persecution of Jews should be voting for the socialists and not somebody who's palling up with far right figures like Viktor Orban across Europe.
100%. In 2017, that was actually a story of the polls being wrong and missing a huge grassroots outpouring of support for Corbyn's Labour Party and for democratic socialism. Do you? I saw some encouraging numbers recently on a spike in young people registering to vote, which is obviously a great signal for Labour. The Lib Dems are collapsing. That's obviously really positive. What do you? I mean, this is the what do you think might happen here question. Does Labour have a shot at forcing a hung parliament, denying the Tories the power to complete their destruction?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I think it's a tough one. And I think this is a question that the left internationally is going to have to grapple with, We're facing huge structural obstacles. A total kind of power of concentrated wealth being against us, all of the big media being against us. In Britain, the political apparatus in the Labour Party, most of it being against them for most of his time. To overcome all of those obstacles and get radical policies introduced is a very hard thing to do. It's part of the reason why, there has been this inexorable drift towards inequality across the world, is that it's a very hard thing to overcome the obstacles in our way. But every time the Labour Party gets into an election campaign, what do we see? We see that the poll difference that had been there tightens because people get exposed to the actual arguments, not some bizarre distortion presented by Rupert Murdoch-owned media. Or give you a context, right? 60% of the newspapers read in this country every day are about two companies, the Daily Mail Group and Rupert Murdoch's News UK. I mean, that's 60%, right? So they are pushing out every single day into thousands of homes. They are pushing out anti-Corbyn propaganda. And then it isn't until people get to experience an election campaign where Labour mobilises, 500,000 people to knock on doors, to campaign for the party and to talk about their actual policies and what they would mean for people's lives, we see a resurgence. And this has happened in 2017, and now we're seeing it again in 2019. The question of whether we can overcome the scale of the obstacles, in such a short period of time, or just a few weeks, where people are actually being encouraged to listen to things about the NHS again. No one has talked about the NHS for so long with Brexit. It's just been off the table and not considered. And then people are being given just a few kind of weeks and this short, sharp shock to think about the NHS, their kids' schools, their wages, all of these questions. Whether we can do it, I'm not sure. There are some positive signs. The gap is closing again for the reason I've said. A lot of the polling companies are using models for this election that are based on low turnout amongst young people, like significantly down, about a quarter or a third down under 35 from the last election. And some of them go up to having significantly lower turnout under 50. I would be surprised if that happens, but it could. I mean, the December election had a lot of problems to it. A lot of people are working terrible shifts, Christmas shifts. It's cold out there. It's a very different atmosphere to the June election. But the voter registration information indicates something else. It's the largest increase that we have seen in the modern times of young people registering to vote. Whether or not that can tip Labour over, I don't know. I have to say that there are, I'm one of these people who gets a bit worried when politics gets realigned as young versus old basis and whatever, not only because it can be damaging to kind of class politics, but also because the record is very clear, right, that older people come out and vote and they do it reliably and they do it in big numbers, and younger people are less so. But it is certainly the case that a lot of young people have registered to vote. And if those registration numbers are reflected in turnout, then the polling rules that we've seen, you will not be right. It might still be a Tory majority, we don't know, but it simply won't be the case if those registration numbers are reflected, that we're going to have a huge, 1/3 drop in under 35 voting, while millions of young people have registered. That seems unlikely.
Ronan Burtenshaw, Solidarity good luck. If you're in the UK, my God, don't fuck around. Vote for Labour. Thanks so much, man.